Welcome to the Prairie Oaks Bible Study, and I am glad you're joining me. So, last week we started out with some of the 10 Commandments, and we even took a quiz just to see how well you did. So, have you been studying? Are you getting them memorized? We start out. He says that I am the Lord your God who delivered you from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. He spoke that from the mountain. And so one God, God first. He said, you should not make any graven images. He said, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. And so we talked about those three last week. Number 4, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Number 5 is to honor your mom and dad. Number 6, you shall not murder. Number 7, do not commit adultery. Number 8, do not steal. Number 9, what is it? Do not bear false witness. And number 10, do not covet. And so those are the compendium, the 10 commands that God spoke from Mount Sinai to all the children of Israel, and then had Moses come up the mountain and he wrote it with his own finger into the rock so that they would have a permanent record of God's covenant with them. And this week we deal with remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And it's worth reading it in its full, extensive glory, because that's not all he said. It's actually one of the longest commands in there. Exodus 20, verse 8 says, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So he had more to say about that one than just about any other one. And so let's kind of spend some time here. In fact, we're going to just look at this one for today. Now, this isn't the first time they've been given the principle of the Sabbath, because we saw when we were a little earlier in Exodus that when he gave manna, he gave it to him for 6 days, but on the seventh, it would not have manna on the ground. But instead, they would be allowed to gather up double on the 6th day so that they could still eat, feast even, on the 7th day without having to lift a finger. They wouldn't even have to work. They were to do whatever preparation they were going to do on the 6th day, and then on the 7th, they would rest. And so, he'd already given them the principle. But it's not the first time that the Sabbath is mentioned, because as this verse points out in verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh. Genesis 2, kind of a little tag that bleeds over into the next chapter of Genesis 1, he made everything in 6 days, but on the seventh, he rested. He wasn't tired, he wasn't weary, but he enjoyed the fruits of his labor, so to speak. He made this creation and he enjoyed it. He rested and he ceased from the creating activity. Maintained, but did not do any more creating. And so he blessed it and he hallowed it. He set it apart as holy. He set it apart as unique from the other days. And so the reality is that this is why we have a 7-day week on our calendars to this day. Following the example given to the Jews through our Christian heritage, we have a 7-day week. And it kind of helps out with you get 4 weeks out of the lunar month, but the lunar month is a little longer, so even then it doesn't balance out quite right. The 7-day week is directly a reflection of honoring this command. But as American, and especially Gentile Americans, Christians, this is probably the command out of all 10 that might make us the most uncomfortable, because we realize, I don't know that we're doing this right. And that's probably a good thing to feel, is to feel a little uncomfortable with remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy. But let's back up a second and re-look at what we started with. Verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. The Lord gave this to the children of Israel. Here in his original covenant with the nation of Israel, he gave them this command. It's a principle that goes back to creation, so there's value there, and we're going to unpack that a little later. But this is a command to the children of Israel under the Old Covenant, what we call the Old Covenant, the covenant given at Sinai. And as such, Jesus has fulfilled this. And so as Christians, we're under a new covenant. And I dare say it's hard to make an argument from silence, but there's a lot of silence in the New Testament in that the Sabbath is not commanded again. In fact, we're going to spend some time in this Bible study looking at how Jesus interacted with the Sabbath and the Sabbath regulations that were common in his day under the Pharisees. And so, does that mean we don't need to worry about this? Not so fast. But there's a couple things I want us to really notice here before we leave Exodus to go to the Gospels. 6 days you shall labor. God honors labor. God expects labor. But then he also has set apart, he has hallowed this one day apart for himself. As the Lord of creation, this day belongs to him. And when this command gets repeated in Deuteronomy, in the same 10 commandment order, it's worded a little differently. And it goes back to God reminds them, I set you free from the house of bondage, just as he said there in verse 2. And so it is a reminder of his salvation when they remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And it wasn't just for the rich. It wasn't just for those who were going to be religious. The seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord. In it you shall do no work, not you, not your son, not your daughter, not your male servant, not your female servant, not even your cows, not even your sheep, not even your goats, not even the guy that's just sojourning coming through. Everybody takes a break on the Sabbath. Everybody was supposed to take a break on the Sabbath. And so this was a very egalitarian command. Egalitarian meaning it applied to everybody, no matter where you were on your social status. If you were the pauper, you still got the day off. If you were the slave and didn't even own yourself, you were to get the day off, because everything belongs to God, and God says, you take the Sabbath. And it's worth noting here that sentence I started with, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord. The Sabbath term directly applies to what we would call Saturday. So when you read Sabbath, the scriptures are very consistent. It's referring not just to any holy day that God had set apart, it's referring to that Saturday. Once a week, they were to be reminded God provided for them, and He could provide for them well enough that they wouldn't need to work all 7 days. They could take one day off and trust God. And now that's why you say, this is a little disconcerting for us, because we don't feel like we can ever stop. Some of us, we don't ever get started, but some of us, we never can stop. And I kind of feel guilty about this, in that God says, no, trust me. You need a Sabbath. I created the entire universe in 6 days and rested on the seventh. You haven't done even near that much, but you can still take the Sabbath. I'm preaching at me, and probably preaching at you as well, because that's one of the tensions we feel as Americans, is that we want to be busy. It's almost a badge of honor to be busy. But God says we need to take a rest. And with it being set apart, not just rest, take a nap, but to rest in that it is holy, keep it holy, unique and separate, and for God's purposes. There needs to be set times for God in our week, really in our day, but especially in our week. There needs to be time for God, with God, about God. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord, your God. In it you shall do no work. Normal stuff ends, God stuff then. And so it was a command. And they were kind of like us. It was hard to keep that Sabbath. And the short list of reasons God gives for why He kicked them out of the promised land and sent them into exile into Babylon, they didn't keep the Sabbath. They didn't keep the Sabbath of days, 1 day a week. They didn't keep the Sabbath of years, where every seventh year everything would rest. The land would lie fallow, and they just eat on what they had prospered the 6th year. The Sabbath was very important to him. And so you see in the days of Nehemiah, if you look in that little book, Nehemiah gets super irate with the exiles who have returned, and they're not honoring the Sabbath. He turns his back, he's gone for a little bit, and when he comes back, they're back to just 7 days a week. And he pulls out his hair, and he has a fit, and he says, don't you know this got us in so much trouble before? He enforces the Sabbath. And Ezra and Nehemiah is what is pointed to as the beginning, the germinated seed of what we see in the New Testament as the Pharisees. They were going to enforce the laws of God. And specifically, or included in that, is the Sabbath. And so when we get to the Gospels, we find that there's considerable tension between Jesus' understanding of the law, and specifically the Sabbath, and the Pharisees' understanding of the Sabbath. And I really kind of challenge you to spend some time in the Gospels maybe this week. So still keep memorizing the 10 Commandments, but Matthew chapter 12, Mark chapter 2 and 3, in Luke chapter 6, spend some time looking at the Sabbath. They actually tell the same story 3 different ways, making 3 different points about Jesus and one of his interactions with the Sabbath. When you get to John's gospel, he doesn't use the same story, but you begin to think, wow, Jesus really did a lot of things on the Sabbath, making a point of the Sabbath. And how he interacted with the Sabbath is very telling for us. But I've chose Mark chapter 2, because Mark records Jesus' words that are going to be really helpful for us in this part of our discussion of remember the Sabbath. There's a lot more that can be said. In fact, I hope we get a chance to really dig into Matthew chapter 12 at some point and his teaching on the Sabbath from what Jesus taught him. But we're going to look at Mark chapter 2 and specifically one event here. So Mark chapter 2, verse 23. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. So Jesus is going through the grain fields, and it's the Sabbath day. And I pause for a second here because now the Pharisees had some very strict rules about how the Sabbath was supposed to work. And it was specifically, you didn't do anything resembling work. You didn't light a fire. You did all your cooking the day before, and so you ate leftovers all day on the Sabbath. And they made a feast on Friday afternoon, so that when the sun went down on Friday, on the 6th day, then they had a lot of food and they feasted, and it was a day of celebration on the Sabbath. And so that's the norm. So you didn't go very far. It was just a short little distance that you could walk. I can't remember the exact numbers of it. But you just stayed home, kind of enjoyed family. You went to the synagogue. There was always supposed to be a synagogue or something within just that short Sabbath day journey. Remember that expression from the Gospels? And you would worship. So when you read about Jesus being in the synagogue teaching, know that that day is a Sabbath. So watch what happens on those days. Because a lot of times there's hidden things to us as Gentiles, as Americans, that we don't catch on until you start looking for the clues. But on this one, Mark puts the cookies on the bottom shelf. He says, now it happened that he, being Jesus, went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? But Jesus said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath. And so you got the picture. They're going through the grain fields on the Sabbath, probably wheat or barley or something like that. They didn't have maize, what American corn is or anything like that. But they were just those kind of heads of grain. And as they went, they were plucking them off, rubbing it between their hands, getting the husk out of the way so they could eat the kernels. They could eat the little kernels of grain. And by Pharisee standards, they're not supposed to be doing that. That's work. You're threshing wheat. Well, seriously, guys. Seriously. They're not harvesting the field. They're just walking along the edges, what was allowed anyways, and they were just getting enough for them to eat. They were getting a little snack so they wouldn't be starving, In fact, it was kind of against the rules to even fast on the Sabbath, and they were supposed to eat. And so they needed to eat, and they ate. But the Pharisees, no. And we know they're kind of nitpicking, looking for reasons to pick a fight with Jesus anyways. But in the end, the rules are what they had made their rules to be. And so the disciples seem to be breaking the rules. And Jesus is letting them. He's responsible for these guys. So what do you have to answer, Jesus? And Jesus is not exactly complimentary. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but Jesus' response to them, it'd be sort of like coming up to me and saying, have you ever read the Bible? Yeah. These guys were the teachers of the Bible, and he says, have you never read? Okay. So anyways, he's getting on to him. It's a little hidden clue there. Have you never read what David did? Now, David is a big deal. David was a man after God's own heart. We remember that. We say that like it's real easy. And then we get real uncomfortable with some of the knuckleheaded things he does. And just plain sinful. But David was a man after God's own heart. He's also the ancestor of Jesus, the Messiah. And so he's kind of a big deal because of that too. But when he was in need and hungry, two important things. And it's not life-threatening. He wasn't about to starve, but he was hungry. He was in need. He and those with him. And he was at the house of God, and he asked the high priest, and just pause for a second here. High priest was Ahimelech. He was the old man. His son Abiathar was going to be the next high priest. And so there's kind of some overlap there. Abiathar is the more famous of the two. The son kind of outweighs the father on this one. And so Abiathar, Ahimelech, whichever one is doing the talking, making the decision, they give David the showbread. What's the showbread? Good question. The showbread is the bread that sat on a table in the tabernacle that signified the presence of God. And once a week, the old loaves were taken off, new loaves were put in place. And as the loaves were coming off, the priest gave them to David instead of following the letter of the law, which was only priests could eat it. Now, there's some big stuff going on here. He's not just breaking the rules. He's taking care of someone in need. Sort of like those disciples who are over there eating kernels of grain out of a field because they're hungry. They're also giving it to David, who David is going to be the closest anyone of the Old Testament will come to blurring the line of king and priest, except for maybe Moses himself. Because David is going to tell the priests how to do their job when he becomes king. And he eats the showbread, not lawful for any except for the priest to eat. And then he gave some to them who were with him. Because basically he was taking the role of the priest and giving it to those with him. But more important in this is that he was in need and in hungry. And Jesus teaches us the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. These laws were made for man's good. And man wasn't made just for keeping some laws. Compassion. God desires mercy, not just sacrifice. God desires us to think with our hearts as well as with our minds. Now, he's still very serious about his laws. Remember, he kicked them out of the promised land because they didn't keep this law. of remember the Sabbath. So the Pharisees are right in that regard. But they had made the law more of a weapon than as a blessing. And Jesus turns the table on them and says, no, this was made for man. And I think this is an important point for us. A lot of times we see these laws and we just feel the burden of them. Oh, it's so hard. No, they're for our good. They're for our good. And the Sabbath is a classic example of that. And so when we're burning ourselves out, running nonstop 7 days a week, we're hurting ourselves. And we really do know it. And God has made a command to tell us to stop it. Take a break. Come and worship Him. Replenish our souls to worship with Him. The Sabbath was made for man. The laws were made for man. And so as we go through the 10 Commandments, I want you to think about the things how that is for our good. Yeah, even the not taking the Lord's name in vain. Don't make idols. Don't waste your life on things like that. Do not covet. Learn to be content. Jesus is challenging them and us to remember these things are for our good, to rescue us from ourselves. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. There was compassion to be done. And the next story is one in which, in Mark 3, we don't have time for it today, but he heals a man without lifting a finger. I mean, he is the epitome of not working and doing miraculous works. He's like, just stretch out your hand. The guy didn't do any work. Jesus didn't do any work. And the Pharisees were furious because they knew they'd been had. Jesus had done miraculous things. But Jesus' point was simple. What's the law of the Sabbath for? Is it to do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill it? It was for our good. And so there's a lot more to be said about this command. This is where we're going to let off today. So we're working on your 10 commands, getting them all straightened out, but then also kind of spend some time looking through the Gospels, looking for where Jesus is giving us some insights into his thoughts on the Sabbath. There's a lot more to come in that regard. We may do that next week. But in the meantime, God bless you, God keep you, and thanks for joining me for Bible study.